There is a building in northern Sudan that should not still exist. It is made of mud, sun-dried mud brick, laid by hand. It stands somewhere around 18 to 20 meters, call it 60 feet, and it is solid almost the whole way through. It was built after 1750 BC. That is roughly 3,500 years of wind, flood and heat, and it is still there. You can walk up and put your hand on it. It is called the Western Deffufa. It was the temple at the heart of a city called Kerma, the first city in Africa south of Egypt, and the capital of the first kingdom to rise there. Now, you may have heard of the kingdom of Kush. Kush conquered Egypt. Kush had pharaohs. Kush gets the documentaries. That Kush is the second one. This is the first, 1,000 years earlier, same river and the same name in the Egyptian records. By 1700 BC it was strong enough to invade Egypt from the south, while Egypt was being invaded from the north, and in 1913, the first archaeologist to dig here stood in the shadow of this building, looked at everything that came out of the ground, and decided Africans could not have built it. Hold on to that man for a minute. His name was George Reisner, and he is the reason this episode exists. Because to understand how someone that careful got it that wrong, you have to see what he was standing on, and it starts with the river. Nile isn't one smooth road. It's broken by cataracts, stretches of rock and rapids, where boats have to be unloaded and hauled. Each one is a natural choke point, and whoever holds a choke point on a trade river holds the trade. Nile Mind, Kerma sat near the third cataract, above the barrier, on good farmland. Everything moving north out of inner Africa, gold, ivory, ebony, incense, cattle, people, came past this point. By 2500 BC there was a city here, walls, streets, workshops, storerooms, thousands of people living together and being fed by somebody's organization, and at the center, that mud brick mountain. It was not thrown up in one go. It was rebuilt and enlarged over centuries, and the version you can walk up to today is the last one from the kingdom's final stretch. Inside it isn't one hall, it's a series of chambers and courtyards, a temple and the religious heart of the whole kingdom. Nair pottery alone should have settled the argument. Kerma made a beaker with a mirror-polished red body and a hard black rim, the two colors meeting in a fine gray line. It is some of the finest ceramic work produced anywhere in the ancient world. Egyptians imported it. Nobody has fully reproduced how they did it. Now to the part that gets left out. Around 1780 BC, Egypt came apart. Central authority collapsed. In the north, a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos took the delta and ruled it from a city called Avaris, and in the south, Kerma moved. Egypt had built a chain of massive fortresses through Lower Nubia to keep exactly this from happening. Kerma took them, not raided, took and held and garrisoned them. Then it got worse for Egypt. At Kerma, archaeologists have found seals carrying the names of the northern rulers and designs from Avaris, and there is a text, carved by the Egyptian pharaoh Kamasi himself, boasting about the war, that records his men intercepting a letter. It was from the Hyksos king Apipi, and it was addressed to the king of Kush. And that word is worth stopping on, because it trips people up constantly. Kush was never one kingdom. It is what the Egyptians called whoever was living south of them, and they used it for 2,000 years. So when Kamoses' scribe writes the king of Kush, he does not mean the pharaohs with the ram's horn crowns who conquered Egypt in 730 BC. That is the late Kush, 1,000 years after this. He means the man sitting in the mud brick temple at Kerma, right now, holding Egypt's southern forts and reading Apepi's mail. The two powers, squeezing Egypt from opposite ends, were talking to each other. And we know how far south to north went, because an Egyptian nobleman carved it on his own tomb wall. His name was Sobek Nakht. His tomb is at el-kab, that is deep in Upper Egypt, well past Aswan, a long way from any border. He describes a Kushite army arriving there, not a raiding party at the frontier, in the heartland, threatening the kings at Thebes. And he names who came with them, fighters from Lower Nubia, from Upper Nubia, from the Medjay, and from Punt. Punt. If you watched the episode on Punt, that is the same trading kingdom in the Horn of Africa that Egypt sailed 1,000 miles to reach. It wasn't only trading with Egypt, it was in the alliance against it. Everything you were taught about this river runs one way, Egypt going south, into an empty land, bringing order. For about 200 years, the traffic ran the other way. Across the desert east of the city is the cemetery. Thousands of graves, marked by low circles of black and white stone. And then there are the royal ones. The largest is about 90 meters across. Inside is a honeycomb of mud brick walls and a long central corridor. The king was laid in the middle on a carved wooden bed inlaid with mica between two ox hides, and in the corridor leading to him, more than 300 other people were buried at the same time. They were placed on the floor, often in groups, and covered with hide. I'm not going to soften that. It happened, it was deliberate, and it is one of the largest mass burials of its kind known anywhere. Nazaz and Alpo. Archaeologists have argued for decades about who those people were, prisoners taken in the wars with Egypt or members of the king's own household going with him. The skeletal evidence points to the second answer, his own people, which is, if anything, harder to think about. Kerma was a powerful, wealthy, organized state. It was also that. Both are true, and a channel that only tells you the flattering half isn't telling you history. Around 1550 BC, Egypt got itself back together. A pharaoh named Ahmose drove the Hyksos out of the delta, and then he kept going, south, because Egypt had not forgotten who else had been at its throat. Kerma was broken around 1500 BC. The city was taken, the kingdom ended, and Egypt occupied Nubia for the next 400 years. But the Deffufa stayed standing. It has never not been there, which brings us to 1913, and to a man named George Reisner. Reisner was one of the most capable field archaeologists of his generation. He dug Kerma for 3 years. He recorded meticulously, and he got the answer completely wrong. His conclusion was that Kerma had been an Egyptian outpost, run by an Egyptian governor. And watch the mechanism, because it is the whole point of this channel. When he found something exquisite, he filed it as Egyptian influence. When he found something plain, he filed it as Nubian. Quality itself was treated as evidence of foreignness. Under that rule, no African site can ever be African. The better it is, the less it counts, and that stood as the published account for about 50 years. Then a Swiss archaeologist named Charles Bonnet started digging at Kerma again, and kept at it for the better part of 40 years. And he found the thing Reisner's theory couldn't survive: buildings, tombs and pottery that were older than the Egyptian invasion of 1500 BC. Kerma existed, fully formed, centuries before Egypt ever controlled it. There was no Egyptian governor. There was a Nubian kingdom, with its own architecture, its own burial customs, its own pottery, running its own affairs, and, for a while, running Egypt's border forts too. Here is what gets me about this one. Nothing was lost. Nothing was hidden. The largest structure for hundreds of miles was standing in the open the entire time, exactly where its builders left it. The evidence was never the problem. Someone just decided in advance what it was allowed to mean. Archaeologists today are going back through Reisner's own notebooks, his measurements, his photographs, his records, and finding that the data was fine. It was the conclusion that was imported. If you want the sequel to this story, the Kingdom of Kush episode is already on the channel. That's the same people, 1,000 years later, going north and taking Egypt outright. And I want your take on this one. If Reisner had found the Deffufa in Europe, how long do you think it would have taken anyone to ask who really built it? Comments. Next time, we leave the river completely. The middle of the Sahara, a kingdom that farmed the open desert by mining water from under it, and knew, while they were doing it, that it was going to run out.